Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name is Brian, and in this video we're going to be going over a tactics review and list discussion centered around Oberyn Martell, the Prince of Dorne. I do frequent a lot of game stores in the area. That's one of the nice things about being from like South Central Wisconsin is there's tons and tons of game stores all over the place. One of the ones that I frequent the most would be Valhalla Hobbies in Verona, Wisconsin. And the funny thing about my trip there always whenever I'm going to pick up a new Ice and Fire release or go to an Ice and Fire tournament is I always pass this true value, and it's like it taunts me every time saying like, don't worry, you'll get them eventually. But eventually happened, of course, and I went to pick up my Martells, so passing this true value store meant a lot more to me than what it ever has. It's just kind of funny how we find these strange occurrences in life that are just really coincidental. It's just it always makes me chuckle whenever I pass this place. So in addition to having a physical location, Valhalla Hobbies also has an online store called Comics, Games, and Things, and they host a large amount of 3D print or STL files. I don't know what you would call them, STL dealers. That kind of sounds like it's a little bit illegal, but and maybe, who knows, we'll get outlawed by the Games Workshop police for 3D printing things. But up until then, they house all these. They're kind of like a hub for a bunch of these STL distributors. Additionally, they also sell discount minis for just about any game you could possibly think of. The breadth of what they carry is extremely wide, and the folks over at Valhalla Hobbies or Comics, Games, and Things have always treated me well. Every single time I need an Ice and Fire release, they almost reach out to me first to make sure that I need them, and they always get them to me in a timely fashion. I never have to worry about anything being out of stock or missing out on something. They've been extremely consistent in making sure that I get all of my products at a really fair price. If you head on over to their store, you can use one of the links in the description below, and that'll get you an additional 5% off on any of their prices. And again, it doesn't matter if it's Ice and Fire or Marvel Crisis Protocol or whatever kind of game, even Moonstone or Bushido. It's just intense. Whenever you walk into that store, it's like a serial war gamer's paradise. There's just tons of stuff everywhere, and if you can't find it there, I would kind of be shocked in general. The folks who run that place are avid wargaming fans, and they make sure that they take care of their locals as well as anyone who happens to frequent their online store. So if you're looking for a new place to purchase your miniatures that respects you as though a small store would, or a small hometown operation would, but offers you the discounts of a large-scale warehouse company without having to wait 4 stupid weeks for your Old Dominion to come because you have a stupid tournament that you need to get ready for, Valhalla Hobbies is the place for you to try and check out, or Comics, Games, and Things. They're just a phenomenal store. I always have great experiences working with them, and I really look forward to seeing what the future has to hold for them. So back to the task at hand. When I had first picked up my Martells, I was thumbing through all of the commanders, and of course this happened before I got them, but whatever. And I realized that the Heroes Box 1, this was all happening while I was trying to figure out which one of these commanders I wanted to talk about first. And Heroes Box 1 offers some really interesting options to the Martells, but they don't really lean specifically into what the Martells are trying to do. I feel like Harmon Uller and Oberyn Sand kind of bring a different style to the Martells than what the starter box contents do. It's really interesting how that kind of worked out for them. I'm looking forward to trying to build with them, but for right now, I wanted to start off with Oberyn Martell because I think he brings some really cool things to the table, lots of new mechanics for sure, and I figured we could start off with his commander cards to see what he's actually going to do with the tactics deck and the rest of the faction in general. So starting off, we have Unexpected Exhaustion. This triggers when a vulnerable enemy activates. You attach this card to that enemy unit until the vulnerable token is removed. While this card is attached, each time this unit attacks, it suffers -1 to hit. While this card is attached, each time this unit attacks Oberyn Martell's unit, before rolling the attack dice, it becomes weakened. So Unexpected Exhaustion is in itself a really interesting and powerful card. It does have the stipulation that the enemy needs to be vulnerable, and at the first glance that you could kind of view that as maybe a weakness or a lack of the card, because your opponent can control whether their unit is vulnerable or not with either the tactic zone or particular cards or abilities that their NCUs happen to bring. But what Unexpected Exhaustion does is that it keeps your opponent on their toes. They are always like, okay, well, I have this vulnerable unit. Should I activate it to get the attack out of the way and just leave the vulnerable token on? Or should I try to activate the other thing that I've got that's going to try and remove this vulnerable token? And that kind of plays with your opponent's activation priority, and I think that's probably one of the more powerful things in the game that someone can do, is make your opponent have to do things that they're not necessarily thrilled to be doing. Because in the case that the vulnerable unit activates, they're going to be suffering -1 to hit if you end up triggering this card, and there aren't many ways in the game to activate and then remove a token. At least, and that's me just kind of spitballing. I don't think there are, and that's why I kind of want to err on the side that there might be. But at any rate, having -1 to hit is a pretty powerful ability within this faction in general. The Martells are not renowned for their great defense saves, so having -1 to hit is extra insurance. Now on a charge, it kind of blows because your opponent gets to re-roll those dice, but we have ways of stacking multiple -1 to hits, and with this card making Oberyn Martell's unit extremely protected, it de-incentivizes your opponent from coming after his unit. So Unexpected Exhaustion is powerful on its own, but when you start looking at what it does within the atmosphere of decision making, it can be extremely powerful if your opponent knows it exists and is trying to play around it. If they don't know it exists, then it's just going to do weird things, and you don't have to worry about manipulating your opponent. But I think part of the power within this card is that it makes your opponent do things in an order they would not particularly like to do them in. Next up in Oberyn's lineup, we have Intercept Orders. This triggers when an opponent targets a unit with a tactic zone. You roll a die, and on a 3+, your opponent must target a different unit with that zone's effect if able. And if you control the crown, you can re-roll this die. So we've seen this card on Tyrion Lannister Halfman. I'm pretty sure that's his secondary name. But with Oberyn Martell, especially when we consider Unexpected Exhaustion, if their only way to really remove vulnerable tokens is through the coin on the tactics zone, you can really string out the effectiveness of the Unexpected Exhaustion card. They might be like, okay, well, I need to activate this NCU to take off that vulnerable token so I don't have to worry about Unexpected Exhaustion messing me up. Play Intercept Orders, get your 3+, make them target something different that doesn't really have any effect, because the if able is the real big thing here. You can mess with things in that combat zone, but you have to have something that actually could make the attack in order to target it. I'm pretty sure. That one you might have to correct me on in the comments, but if you can't make an attack action, then I don't think you're eligible to be targeted by the swords. So that one might get a little muddy. But at any rate, Intercept Orders can change, like anything, whether if you're full and have no condition tokens on you, you can still be targeted by that coin zone. And same thing with targeting the maneuver zone. If your opponent's trying to retreat or get some extra distance out, you're kind of hampering their advance. Intercept Orders is another one of these things that just controls your opponent and makes them do things that they don't want to do, or take something that they want to do and disallow them from having it happen. I think that with the Martells being as tricksy on the table as they are with their main tactics deck, Intercept Orders can put in a lot of miles that you might not see up front. It's just a fantastic card within this faction. To round out Oberyn Martell's commander cards, we get Viper's Infamy. This is a dual mode card, so you pick one of the triggers to go off. when the first trigger is, or the first mode, sorry, is when an enemy combat unit activates, that enemy suffers -2 speed when charging Oberyn Martell's unit this turn. If that enemy fails a charge this turn, it becomes vulnerable. The second mode is triggered at the start of any turn. You choose one. You draw one tactics card, or if Oberyn Martell's unit is engaged, you search your tactics deck or discard pile for one commander tactics card and add it to your hand. So Viper's Infamy is an extremely versatile card, and I always like that when we're presented with cards that have multiple options. Since it's centered around Oberyn Martell, having the draw one tactics card mode just means that you can try and fish through your deck if you've either burnt through some stuff or Oberyn isn't on the table and it doesn't matter. Another incentive to not charge Oberyn Martell's unit and just let him do what he wants to is Viper's Infamy. -2 to charge is not the greatest place to be when you're trying to do either long bomb charges, or even if you're within a decent range where you're like, you just need a 2 to get in, you're still failing that on 1, 2, and 3. It's not the greatest place to be at all. So, and if you do happen to fail the charge, you become vulnerable, and then Oberyn can charge in and clean you up a little quicker. He kind of gets that extra help from you failing that charge. So it's one of those things where maybe you might be more interested in trying to play a little fast and loose and go for that 4 or 5, but Viper's Infamy can make it so that it's not really the greatest idea in the universe. For that second mode and the second part of it, being able to search your tactics deck for any card that Oberyn brings, as long as he's engaged, we're talking about like Unexpected Exhaustion. You can get some extra mileage out of it because it does let you pull it from your discard pile. So when your opponent always has to be on their toes with this particular combination of cards, because even if they have seen all of the Unexpected Exhaustions, they do have to be very mindful that Viper's Infamy can pull that back, especially at the start of their turn. So you can really mess with your opponent's activation order by saying, okay, start of your enemy turn, right? I'm going to go ahead and play Viper's Infamy to pull back Unexpected Exhaustion from my discard pile. If they have a couple vulnerable units, they will have to think twice about whether they're going to activate the vulnerable unit to try and get the most mileage out of it for a charge or whatever they're trying to do, or if they're going to try and figure out how to get that vulnerable token off so they're not -1 to hit, and if they happen to attack Oberyn's unit, they become weakened, and it's a little bit harder to hit them under those circumstances. So I think Viper's Infamy is a really fun card, even though it seems like it's not the most impressive on the front, considering some would say that the most powerful part of it is probably the more situational Oberyn -2 to charge business, but I think overall this card is extremely good for what it does. Let's scoot over to Oberyn's attachment. So I'm going to skip over the first part, we'll come to that in a second, but he modifies the melee ability of the unit that he gets attached to. The ability that I want to focus on right now is Viper's Fangs. This states when attacking enemies that have not activated this round, the defender becomes vulnerable and weakened. So this particular part of his card synergizes extremely well with his kit in making sure that you get those vulnerable tokens and weakened tokens out to help play into Unexpected Exhaustion. And -1 to hit in general, just stacking with the weakened tokens, makes it so that it keeps Oberyn's unit around for a really long time. It's just a good ability. Now we get to something new in the game, and this particular ability is called Manacore Venom. You'll see that it has the melee modification on it, so it's something that gets stapled to their melee ability. And then there's this little poison skull bottle droppy thing, and that's part of a new mechanic that the Martells are bringing to the game. So Manacore Venom states, once per game, after this unit completes a melee attack, attach the Manacore Venom poison card to the defender until they are destroyed. So then Oberyn ends up bringing the Manacore Venom card that states, this unit cannot restore wounds. If this unit would become vulnerable, but is already vulnerable, it instead suffers 1 wound. Each time this unit activates, it becomes vulnerable. So Manacore Venom is ridiculously powerful. Being able to shut down a unit from healing at all is good. Like if we think about something like Queensmen or Champions of the Stag that have been kind of a pain in a lot of people's butts lately, a lot of their power comes from not just their survivability on their defensive stats, but also the ridiculous amount of healing that they can project with getting Baratheon Conviction over and over and over again. So having Manacore Venom to shut down Queensmen or someone like Jon Snow, or any other, Night's Watch unit that you don't want healing a bunch, Manacore Venom is something that your opponent cannot interact with. There is nothing in the game that will remove this card. So extremely powerful whenever you think, or whenever something comes to the game that has a very limited interactivity from your opponent, like they don't get much of a say in any of this, it tends to kind of stress the limits of what's acceptable in the game. I'm not saying that Manacore Venom is extremely broken, but it does a lot for not being able to allow your opponent to interact with it. You're always going to be vulnerable every time you activate, and since Oberyn has ways to get vulnerable out in multiple circumstances, suffering another wound just makes it so that you're more likely to get through that unit quicker. So I think that the Manacore Venom is just really, really good, or this poison ability that they've added to the game is quite strong. So I should take a moment to just read the backside or front side, whatever side you want to call it, of the card. That just states at the start of the game, place this card close to your tactics deck. And then underneath it says an ability or effect will state when this card is played. So easy peasy, explains how it works. The thing that I am moderately confused by is the wording on Manacore Venom. It states that once per game after this unit completes an attack, you attach Manacore Venom poison card to the defender until they are destroyed. I don't think there's an optional clause in that. So it means to me that the first time that Oberyn makes a melee attack against a unit, they just get Manacored. So you can't say, oh, I'm going to keep this in my pocket until I go after the unit that I want to. Oberyn just ends up putting it on the first unit that he attacks. So I haven't kept my ear to the ground in terms of what other people are thinking about this, but when I read this, it just makes it seem like you don't get an option, really. It's just the first unit that Oberyn attacks. It's kind of like, I feel like it's got a little bit of those Gilly vibes where, like, it might be something that we should be able to control or have options over, but the way the card is written or the way that the rules are stated doesn't allow you to do that. So with that out of the way, in general, I think Oberyn Martell's commander attachment is just super duper powerful. Being able to vulnerable and weaken anything that hasn't activated yet is super strong, especially when you're getting the swords at the top of the turn whenever you have it. And then you're kicking over more wounds if they happen to be Manacored, and we have other ways to get more vulnerable tokens out there. Oberyn is just, in my opinion, the strongest commander in the starter box here, and a lot of that is because of how easily he leans into what he wants to do, and the other part of that is because Doran does have a massive opportunity cost with him as your commander. So I think overall Oberyn is someone you're going to see on the table quite a bit. So now we've just got to try and find a unit to plop Oberyn in, and for 7 points I'm going to be reaching for the Sunspear Royal Guard on this one. They are speed 5 unit with a melee attack called Royal Spear that hits on 3s and has a 7/7/4 decay stat, or decay rate. The defensive stats are a 4+ defense save and a 5+ morale save. They end up bringing the order Martial Training that triggers when this unit's performing a melee attack before rolling attack dice. The attack may re-roll any attack dice, and the defender becomes vulnerable. They also bring the order Shield Wall that triggers when an enemy performs a melee attack on this unit after rolling the defense dice. If this unit's being attacked from the front or flank, it blocks +1 hit for each of its remaining ranks. So there are multiple reasons why I fetch this unit with Oberyn. The 7/7 on the front end is one of the big ones to make sure that they're staying combat effective for as long as possible. They don't have any real modifications to their melee attacks other than just being able to proliferate the vulnerable token like crazy. We have Oberyn with his cards and his attachment ability. Then we have Martial Training as well, and that just means that they're going to be able to punch armor pretty decently without having something like Sundering. The shield wall ability makes sure that Oberyn sticks around a long time as well. We have multiple ways of protecting Oberyn or making sure he sees the end of the game, and shield wall on this unit just makes sure that they for sure stick around. And with a 4/5 defensive stats, I think that is extremely respectable, considering we've also got ways to stack up like -1 to hits. The Royal Guard just seemed like a really good place for any of your Martell commanders, but Oberyn specifically really likes this because it's so easy to get vulnerable out in multiple instances. Next up in the list, I have 2 units of Martell Spearman. For 5 points, we get a speed 5 unit with the spear melee attack that hits on 4s and also has a 7/7/4 decay stat. Their defensive stats are 5+ for defense and 6+ for morale. They have the order set for charge that triggers when this unit successfully charged from the front or flank. If this unit is not engaged with another enemy, it performs 1 melee attack action on the attacker before they perform their melee attack. The second order they bring is Tactical Reposition. This triggers at the start of an enemy turn. You target one friendly unit in short range, and they perform a 3-inch shift. So the Martell Spearmen are extremely supportive, and they are combat effective for the most part. They've got a decent decay stat. 4s are not the greatest, but for 5 points, I can't argue with them. Set for charge means that I don't really need to activate this unit until absolutely necessary. The Martell Spearmen are going to make sure that I kind of bunker up on objectives, and they don't need to actually be in the game to be effective because they have that tactical reposition. Think about the -2 to charge from Oberyn's unit, the Viper's Infamy. Stacking this up with performing that 3-inch shift, it's just another way to mess with your opponent's head, where they're like maybe going through the motions of their turn while you're doing your activation, and they're like, okay, if he wipes this unit out, I'm going to try and charge it with this thing. And then you're just like, whoop, 3-inch shift, and now you've got to stack that with Viper's Infamy. So are you really going to try and like be able to mitigate that 5-inch deficit? And then they have to figure out what they're going to do from there. So I think the Martell Spearmen, I almost will always have 2 of them in every list because they sit on objectives. The tactical reposition is so good. And maybe I'm being a little bit, bombastic when I'm saying I'm never not going to have 2 Martell Spearmen in my list, because there'll be chances where I don't, but they're extremely cheap and they offer a lot of flexibility to the list, and they're just exactly the type of unit you want sitting on an objective. They have a decent enough morale stat to where they're not going to be getting panic zapped from nowhere multiple times by the crown zone. It's kind of a coin toss whether they pass or fail. If you're against Baratheons that are running like Melisandre and Jaqen, then maybe that's a little different. But overall, I think double Spearmen, especially in this list, being able to wing Oberyn's unit out from places or extend threat on another one. Your opponent might not be able to. It's another thing of like kind of presenting multiple options to them and trying to control what they try to do. So you might have your Oberyn and Royal Spearmen or Royal Guard kind of sitting in where it's the obvious charge target. But at the start of the turn, you take something like your Sand Skirmishers and yoink them up 3 inches, and now that gives your opponent maybe another charge that they might not have had before. So it kind of makes it so they're in a very strange position where whatever unit they try to go after, they're going to get punished by the other unit. I think the Martell Spearmen are just a real linchpin for the faction once you actually get them on the table. The next unit I'm reaching for are the Sunspear Dervishes. For 6 points, we get a speed 6 unit with a melee ability called Dervish Blades that hits on 4s and has a 7/6/4 decay stat. Defensively, they have a 4+ defense save and a 6+ morale, so pretty run-of-the-mill, a little bit over the curve in terms of effectiveness on being able to survive with that good morale stat. They do bring the order Swift Retreat, that triggers after an enemy completes a melee attack on this unit performs 1 retreat action. For their Dervish Blades, they have the ability Precision that's always on, but then when attacking enemies that have not activated this round, this attack gains Critical Blow. So stacking Critical Blow and Precision, it's not the hoop dream that it used to be, but still very good. In addition to ignoring armor completely for one of your 6s, you're blowing up into another attack, so it's a good combination, even though it's not bonkers. Then finally, they have a passive ability called Elusive Escape that states this unit may reroll any retreat distance dice, and enemies that this unit disengages from may not pivot and become weakened. So the Sunspear Dervishes in the Martell canon are ridiculously cool. They have an amazing attack stat with 764. The 4 isn't so spiffy, but it's 7/6 is real good, especially for a unit that's going to be protecting itself with its speed and things like Swift Retreat. But the combination of Swift Retreat and Elusive Escape is extremely strong, especially when you're retreating these guys off into the middle of nowhere or getting them into a position where they're going to maybe go after another unit. And then your opponent really can't do much about it because they either have to turn around, face that unit, and walk away and try and expose their back to a different unit. It's just the more you wrap around your opponent with Swift Retreat, Elusive Escape, the more difficult it is for them to kind of plot their turn out better. It's almost like they have to set themselves up for the Swift Retreat, Elusive Escape plans by either having cavalry or positioning things in a really weird way. And again, it's just another way of forcing your opponent to play your game instead of playing the way they want to. Their Dervish Blades are pretty neat. Precision in general is good, but then having the ability to get critical blow if they haven't activated first, it's kind of one of these, if we combine with Oberyn's unit and this one, no matter what, we should be able to attack a unit before it gets a chance to activate, and having that critical blow is going to be really helpful here. So to round out the list here, we're going to be adding for 7 points the Sand Skirmishers. They have a 6 movement. They also have a melee and ranged attack. The Skirmisher's bow is short range, hits on 3s, has a 754 decay stat. Skirmisher blade hits on 4s and has that same 754 decay stat. Defensively, they've got a 4+ defense save and a 6+ morale save, or morale stat. They bring 2 orders with them. The first order being Quickfire. After this unit completes a maneuver or retreat action, they perform 1 ranged attack. They also bring Scout Openings that triggers at the start of a friendly turn. Target 1 enemy unit in long range until the end of that turn. Friendly units attacks on that enemy reroll any attack dice and gain precision. So the Sand Skirmishers are fairly good for their 7 points. They're very reminiscent of those Ranger Hunters. I think if you put Ranger Hunters and the Dervishes together, or the Skirmishers and Dervishes together, you get Ranger Hunters. But Quickfire is really good with short range. You end up getting a total of a 14-inch threat. You move 6, shift 2, and then have a 6-inch range on top of that. So they're maneuverable and can affect the table quite quickly. Scout Openings is extremely supportive. So in addition to being able to do work and get to where they want to with that speed 6, they're able to make sure that you can give your units some extra melee punch, because there isn't a whole lot of it in terms of modifications to the melee abilities unless you're looking at certain commanders. So I think the Sand Skirmishers in general are really good. I have put a Sunspear Lord, or a Spear Lord, on them. For 1 point, they just bring the ability Boldness and Courage that states when the unit attacks, if it's got full ranks, it rolls +1 attack die. Otherwise, it's treated as having +1 rank for attack dice. And this is where things got a little bit weird for me. I wanted the Sand Skirmishers to have the Spear Lord because it helps them stay effective longer. They go from 754 on all of their attacks to 875, which keeps them quite sustainable for some time and makes sure that Scout Openings can get a lot of work if they're the ones taking advantage of it. There was some discussion with myself where I was like, maybe I should remove the Skirmishers, make them Dervishes, and then I get 2 Spear Lords, because then that pumps up the Dervishes quite a bit. But then I could also move the Spear Lord from the Skirmisher unit into the Dervishes and make the Dervishes more sustainable. But I think with them having a better decay drop-off than the Skirmishers, I think it feels more homey in the Skirmishers. But in general, I think that the Skirmishers are just extremely important to what this army is trying to do. They want to try and cut through units, but without having access to massive sundering, it gets a little hard. You will typically be taking a lot of your attacks from the flanks if you're playing this army like correctly in quotes. So you kind of get that pseudo sundering going on there. But for when you don't get that, scout openings is really good, especially when you're looking at the melee sustain that the army has. I think across the board, very rarely are you going to be rolling less than 7 dice for any attacks. And being able to reroll all of those into precision is extremely helpful. I'd be interested in the comments section on how people would approach that 3 different branch option that I have. You know, are you bringing the sand skirmishers a lot in your Martell armies, or are you leaning a little bit more into those dervishes and finding the spear lords to be a little bit more beneficial to you? So we finally come around to the NCUs for the list, and typically this is where things would get a little less complicated, but with the Martells, as true to their fashion, they are bringing a lot of new things in their NCUs that can contort the game quite a bit here, so we're in for a long video. First up, for the criminally low price of 4 points, we have Doran Martell, the Prince of Dorne. He brings the ability Sunspear Secrets that states each time Doran Martell claims the zone indicated for the round, you place 1 order token on him. Then it lists rounds 1 through 6, and there's 2 tactic zones that will satisfy that condition. At the end of each round, if there are 4 or more order tokens on Doran Martell, you gain 2 victory points. That's it. So there's not a whole lot of interactivity from your opponent on this one. Having the ability to choose between 2 different zones means that you're very likely to be able to get this off. And I don't know about everyone else, but when I play against an opponent who's equally matched, the differential between our victory points is not very much. So being able to rocket yourself out 6 victory points by the end of the game or end the game quicker is just, I think, way too strong. First, I think Doran Martell's way too cheap for what he does. He is too flexible. So there's not a whole lot of counterplay here. If your opponent takes the swords round 1, you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to take the coin round 1, and now my condition's met. There's nothing you can do about it. I just think that he's a little off on his balance right now. I think some ways to maybe change him a little bit would be trim it down to 1 zone each round, and then change the number of order tokens to be lower and the number of victory points lower. So that way maybe Doran Martell will only get you 3 victory points per game, and then maybe give him another ability of some variety. Maybe he can get a once per turn claim any zone that an opponent's on or something like that. So that way they can't shut you out completely from it. I don't know. It just seems like he's a little off balance right now, and I'd be interested to see what happens with him in the future, because I would definitely put money down on him getting a change in the near future whenever the next errata or update comes out. We haven't even gotten to the point where he brings a new tactic zone with him too. So we've seen this before in the House of the Dead, but the House of the Dead really wasn't all that amazing after balance changes. But I think the Water Gardens is something you're going to see a lot when you play against Martells along with Doran Martell. So the Water Gardens states that there can only be 1 Water Gardens in the game, and while you control this zone, opponents do not count as controlling tactic zones for abilities or cards. That's bonkers. I think a lot of people's activations or zones they end up taking are highly motivated by the way that their cards are kicked up. And to be able to just shut that down means that your opponent's tactics deck gets exponentially lowered in its effectiveness, because every time you get one of these kickers, you could say, it ends up making the tactics card that much more powerful. Like Counterplot, without being able to re-roll the die, is still scary, but it's not guaranteed scary. There's a very small point of failure between a re-rollable 3+, so being able to shut them down from that, or Fealty to the Crown, like there's so many cards out there that get extremely scary when they have that claimed zone, and just by plopping your butt on a Water Garden, you just shut that down. So I think that the Water Gardens, just for that reason, is crazy powerful, and the Martells don't really care too much about owning tactic zones. They do have cards that get kicked up by owning a tactic zone, but it doesn't make them extremely powerful or potent. There are even some cards that state that they want your opponent to be owning zones, so it's just not a big deal for them. So if your opponent's trying to snipe out Water Gardens, that part of it isn't going to hurt you so much. The other part is if that weren't enough to like that alone would make the Water Gardens good. But on top of that, you have the ability that states on your opponent's next turn if they must activate a combat unit if possible. So I'll say that one more time since I jumbled it up. On your opponent's next turn, they must activate a combat unit if possible. So if we look at round 2 being the big offender here, round 2 and 5, especially round 5 too. If you take Doran Martell, you're at the top of the activation, and you put him on the Water Gardens right away. That's your first activation. Water Gardens is yours. Now your opponent has to activate a combat unit. They cannot take the combat zone if you're engaged or if they have a ranged unit that can shoot. I think a big play for this is going to be turn 2, Doran takes the Water Gardens, you have to activate a unit, and now my Sunspear or my Sand Skirmishers are going to shoot you, and you can't stop it because I got the tactic zone I wanted for my condition to get the order token on him, and now I also get to be able to take a shot. The Water Gardens, the second part would even be good on its own. Being able to force your opponent to do something they don't want to do is extremely powerful. I think that, again, Doran Martell bringing the Water Gardens and the almost guaranteed 6 victory points is just going to really skyrocket him into being a not very fun play experience for your opponent. And I think I'm going to play him a couple times to see if maybe I'm off on my assessment, but I think Doran Martell is probably one of the most ridiculously powerful releases we've seen in the game in a long time. Additionally, I think we might be seeing more Christopher Botley out of Greyjoy players because he currently is probably the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head that can stop a Martell player from getting 6 victory points. He will only let you get 4, but I don't know if that's worth it. But I've had fun playing Botley, so maybe he might see a resurgence here, or just an entrance. So the final NC we're going to talk about that also warrants a long discussion is going to be Tyne or Tenae. I'm not sure how to say it. Tyne Sand is how I'm going to pronounce it. Septa's daughter. For 5 points, we get a hefty NCU that has the ability called Healing Hands. At the start of round 2, you choose one tactic zone. The next time an enemy unit or an enemy NCU claims that zone, attach the Strangler Poison card to that NCU. So now we'll take a look at the Strangler because that is the only ability she has. So 5 points and that's the only ability. It's kind of rough, but the Strangler is a poison card that states at the end of each round, place 1 order token on this card. If that card has 2 or more order tokens, destroy the unit that this card is attached to. Jeepers creepers, this is strong. So we've seen NCU destruction, or not destruction, more like sacrificing in the past. But being able to just take an NCU away from someone, those are important things. And now the Water Gardens gets even more powerful here because your opponent would, if they're bringing 2 NCUs, they're only down to 1. And even when you have 3, losing one of them is really rough because you're trying to leverage that activation power by having extra NCUs, and now you're disadvantaged on the NCU board and disadvantaged in the combat unit game. So Tyne Sand is interesting in that your opponent is the one who needs to make the choice of saying, which NCU am I going to have, which NCU am I going to have potentially die in 2 turns? They can avoid it for sure. But the thing is if they're avoiding it, you're typically going to be shutting them down from something like the swords. So if you pick the swords on turn 2, say you've got round 1 and you're like, okay, or round 2, however you want to stack it to where you can try and activate the swords on turn 2, you can just say, okay, I'm going to have Tyne Sand pick the combat zone. Now, if you take that, you're going to be disadvantaged in that you're going to lose that NCU in 2 turns. But if you don't take it, chances are you're going to use you're going to lose a unit faster than what you normally would because that combat zone is highly contended. It's almost telegraphed. Every single turn is going to be like, if you have the top of the turn, you take the swords once the engagement starts happening or you have a unit that can shoot with that combat zone. So Tyne Sand is another manipulative a manipulative NCU or a manipulative piece that forces your opponent to play the game you want them to play and do things they don't necessarily want to do. So even just having the threat of her can get you an extra 3 attacks a game, and that's enough to take a unit out. So I think she's another one that's extremely powerful. Is she like, does she need to be adjusted? No, I think she's fine the way she is. I don't think she's overpowered or underpowered. I think she's just where she needs to be. But her in combination with Doran and everything else the Martells bring can kind of snowball into this really interesting experience for your opponent. I don't think it's, outside of Doran, I don't think it's a negative play experience. I just think it's a very different one that we've seen, because we do have a couple commanders that kind of manipulate the battlefield and force your opponent to do things, but we don't have a whole faction yet that's been able to do it. And I think the Martells are going to be one of those factions where the more you play them, the better you get with them. Out of the box, it's going to be very difficult to play this faction, but once you start getting those games under your belt, I think they're going to be extremely powerful. So I appreciate anyone who has listened to the last 41 minutes of me talking about this. I know there was the little like plug in the beginning because I really do appreciate what Valhalla brings and just wanted to convey that discount to everyone. But there's so many new things in this faction. It's crazy. Like when we were talking about Targaryens, the newest thing was just the way that the commanders changed things and we got dragons. But with the Martells, they're so unique. And I feel like this really should have been at the beginning of the video, but one of the coolest things about this box, in my opinion, is that if you take a look at the front, on the bottom of the starter box, we have Michael Chanel's name, and next to it is Fabio Curry. Fabio's been putting a lot of time into making sure that this game is good for us, like lots of play testing, being able to, I think he also had a huge hand in designing and developing the Martells as a faction. So I think it's really important that we recognize that Fabio has gotten some recognition from Cool Mini or Not in terms of this game, because he has put a lot of effort into making sure that this game is as good as it is right now. I think that A Song of Ice and Fire is my #1 game within my rotation, and a lot of that is mostly due to Fabio and Michael's commitment into making sure that we have a solid, awesome game experience, and I can't thank either of them enough for presenting us with this game and bringing me as much joy as I've had playing it. Every time something new comes out, there's always something exciting going on with it, something exciting to talk about, and it's all due to them, and I'm extremely happy that Fabio's getting the recognition that he deserves for getting this game, helping get this game to where it is right now. So again, should have been at the beginning, but thanks again for making it to the end here. I look forward to making the next one for you, and I'm certain that it'll be at least half this length, but the Martells just have so many new things to talk about. It's just nuts. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.